Hello and welcome back to the Three Orcs channel. This is David, and this time around I think I'm going to go ahead and review the most powerful spell that Castles and Crusades has, called Summon Familiar. I'm going to go ahead and review this along with you using the Fantasy Grounds interface. That way we can look at the spell at the same time and see what it has to say and why I believe it's the most powerful spell that you can get. So as you see from the spell, it's first level. It takes all three components: vocal, somatic, and material. It takes an entire day to cast. There's no range and no duration and no savings throw. But there is a spell resist, which is particularly only used for a certain kind of familiar. So the way I look at this is, of course, I always let the players cast this before starting the campaign. You know, that way session 1 slot won't be used up by this spell or the material cost of the spell component. I assume that at the university or school or the master mage they apprentice to would have helped them with this spell. Let's review this from the very top, and then we'll get to the point where I think a lot of people miss how powerful this spell really is and what it means in the game. So the first part is obvious, and which most people know how this spell works. But later on, as we read further into the spell, you'd be surprised. A lot of players would be surprised at how powerful this is. So the spell calls forth a familiar. It's a unique companion and a servant, and binds it to the caster. It takes a day, uses up the material cost of at least 100 gold pieces. Like I said, that'll be done before the campaign starts. The familiar is magical, and it's unusually tough and very intelligent. So this is key to how powerful this is to later, when I talk about that. So it's going to be a small animal or a magical beast. The creature serves willingly, but you can only have one familiar at a time. So all that's quite obvious. Next thing to look out for, the next thing to look at is there is an empathetic link that forms between the master and the familiar. It grants special abilities to the master that's detailed below, which is one of the things I was going to get to that's a lot of people miss. This empathetic link functions only if the familiar is within 1 mile of its master. So that's key too, of reining in how powerful this is. But still, a mile is a lot. Familiars do not involve themselves in combat. I think that's based on just the animal familiars, not the magical ones, the more powerful ones. So like a raven or a rat or a toad, they do not enter combat. But they do have stats in case something tries to kill them. So a familiar may fight if its master faces a life and death situation, but magical beast familiars, especially those of evil alignment, might not do so if the familiar feels his own life is in jeopardy. So that points out to the fact that the difference between a regular familiar and a magical one, which is rare. So if a familiar dies, or the master chooses to dismiss it, the master loses a level, and the class that allowed the spell to be cast, and permanently loses the number of hit points the familiar granted the master. So that point right there talks about when you get a familiar, they get hit points, and those hit points are permanently assigned to your wizard. So that first level wizard that started off the game with 2 hit points now suddenly might have 10 hit points. But then again, if the familiar does die, he will lose those extra hit points and also lose a level. A master's experience point total can never go below 0 as the result of a familiar dying. A slain or dismissed familiar cannot be replaced for 1 year and 1 day. So you'll see later how really powerful this is. So this is another thing that reins in how powerful this spell is. You have to have some sort of limitations to how effective this can be. Slain familiars can be raised from the dead, just like a character can be, but they do not lose a level or constitution points. So if a familiar is raised from the dead, the caster will recover the experience points and the hit points lost because of the death of the familiar. So that's great. That's very clear cut. So let's move on. The type of familiar that responds to the spell is random, or some say directed by the deities. The Castle Keeper might apply modifiers to the roll, especially if more than the usual special materials are used in casting the spell. So I would assume that if you wanted to roleplay more with spell components with your players, and they wanted to use a material component that's more valuable than what they would usually use, rather than 100 gold piece gem or so, let's say that they wanted to use 1,000 or 5,000 gold piece equivalent gem or whatever it is. The Castle Keeper may allow the character to choose, in certain unusual circumstances are met, as part of the story of the game. Of course, that would be like the backstory of a character, or maybe during the game when he wants to know the familiar, maybe there's something going on with the backstory. The caster may refuse to accept that familiar that is summoned, but the caster will be unable to cast that spell again for 1 year and 1 day. So if you don't pick that familiar, then he's got to wait a year. And as we all know in campaigns, probably never. Some magical beast familiars serve only a master of certain alignment. So that magical beast is summoned by a spell, and it refuses to serve the caster because of the alignment problem. So if you summon a magical beast that's chaotic evil, and you're maybe lawful good, that familiar will refuse to serve you, and he'll return to whence he came, and you'll lose your 1 year, 1 day recast time. Let's see. So now we have a table to go by. So, like they said earlier in the spell description, you could pick based on maybe character, player background, or story element, but usually you roll the die. And of course, you could also modify the die, but if the DM allows, based on story element or something like that. I usually let the players pick, just up to the DM. So, as you see, the first 18 is normal animals, but they still have a lot of powers. It tells you the type of animal it is, and then its special abilities. The special abilities is something you need to really focus on because they are huge. They're much more than what people think they are. So we're going to remember these. Okay, then of course, if you roll a 19, the CK can pick, but he can pick any time you wanted to, so I don't know why they put that there. And 20 is the one time you get the magical beast, and there's another sub-table to roll on. So here's some sample stats of these creatures. So if they get the cat, let's go back up. I'm going to make this bigger. There we go. We can see both the table and the descriptions at the same time. So the cat is 2d2 hit dice. So that's anywhere from 2 to 4 hit points. Their armor class is 14. They move 30. Their primary attributes are physical and mental. That means their savings throws, primes, are all physical and all mental stats. So it's 12 or higher no matter what. So if something's trying to kill them or a spell effect hits them, it's a prime, which is really powerful. By the way, as a side note, dragons are like that, and a lot of demons are too. They actually have saves with all 6 are primes. Some people don't notice that by looking through the books. So, if the cat is threatened in combat, the damage of their attack doesn't do any damage. But they have special abilities. So, cats don't have combat, but they can be killed, so they can try to run away or dodge or get away. Hawks, same thing, but the hawks get 2d6 hit dice. So, 2 to 12 hit points, and that can be added. That will be added to the wizard. They have armor class 14. They move 5 or 120 in flight. Their primes are physical and mental too. They attack with talons, and their beak does 1d2 damage. Their talons do 1 point of damage, and their beak does 1d2 points of damage. So they can attack, but they generally won't unless they feel like they're going to save your life. So it's really pretty much up to the DM. The owl is 2d6 as well. That's a lot of hit points. Armor class 14, move 5 and 60. Their primes are physical and mental. They attack with talons, 1 point of damage, and 1d2 for the beak. Same thing as the hawk. Raven, they are 2d2 hit dice. Armor class 14, move 5, move 60. Primaries are physical and mental. They do not participate in combat and flee when danger threatens. So they'll never fight. They just run or fly away. The toad, 2d8. The toad has the most hit points. So if the player is looking for a lot of hit points, the toad is the only way to go. Up to 16 points. That's more than any fighter or barbarian will have in the game at first level. They have our high armor class 16, and they move 10 or 20 for jumping. Their primes are all 6, physical and mental. They hide for camouflage. But if anything comes into contact with their skin, they have to make a Constitution save, or be affected by a Type 1 through 4 poison. So it's up to the CK. So I guess if you want to get realistic, you can figure out what frog it is and reverse engineer, Google it. Maybe you can figure out what kind of frog they summoned and attach a poison to it. You put as much detail into this as you want, but they do have poison effect. Weasel, which is really popular. It does have 2d4 hit dice, up to 8 points. Armor class 13, which is the lowest on this chart. They move 30 or climb 20. Primes are mental and physical like the rest of them. And they avoid combat, so they don't do any damage even if they do get into combat. But they're very stealthy. They're great scouts. I treat them as rogues. Gotta remember, though, those attributes are all primes. So when you try to do a rogue, like hide, sneak, here, it's all 12 or higher because they're primes. Okay, so this is all cool and everything, but this spell is even more powerful than this at first glance. So let's keep going. So the basics of familiars here. So remember everything we just went over. On top of all that, the hit dice, double the hit dice for a normal animal of that type. That's a general rule of thumb. So if you want to pick a different animal that's not on that list, this is a rule of how to create your own familiars. So it would be double the hit dice of the normal animal of that type. Hit points. The familiar's hit points are added to the master's hit points as long as they are within 1 mile. So there's that rule right there that some people don't miss. They get those hit points permanently as long as they're within 1 mile. Savings throws. So the familiar uses the master's base savings throw bonuses if they're better than the familiar. So you'll have to look at that because the familiar savings throws are pretty good. But then again, the caster might have a prime plus a high number, like a +3 to wisdom, and a wisdom's a prime. So now you need not only a 12, but you need a 9 or higher, where the natural wisdom save on a familiar would only be 12 or higher. So there you go. So you add the bonus modifiers. Empathetic Link. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped something. Intelligence. So their intelligence are 9 to 12. So 10 is average human. That means these are people in their heads. They communicate. You talk to them. They understand everything you say. They think logically. They can figure things out. You pretty much treat them as an NPC. You can roll or pick. Then the next one is special abilities. So as the chart above showed what those special abilities were, or their enhanced senses. In addition to all that, the familiar can communicate with animals of the same type as itself. The communication is limited by the intelligence of that creature. So if you have a raven and he's talking to other ravens or other birds, I would say, it would be very low intelligent conversation trying to gather information. So I would usually let the raven help if he's scouting. He's looking for danger. He might be able to get the other ravens to tell him, big monster, scary monster over here, or a lot of them over here. Very limited information. It would kind of help him scout or gain knowledge around in the area outdoors. I'd role play it like that. The next and last one is very powerful. This actually talks about the empathetic link. The link allows the master to communicate telepathically with the familiar for up to 1 mile. That's huge. Some familiars may be able to communicate verbally. So there is a familiar that does talk. That means he can talk to the other NPCs and players as well because he speaks out loud. And I think that's the raven. Let's scroll up real quick. It's right here in the chart. Yep, the raven actually speaks common. That's huge. It's like having a henchman with you that can talk to. You can send messages, or the raven can talk to the other players in the group. I can see that being very powerful. So some familiars may be able to communicate verbally. The telepathic communication is typically better in conveying any meaning and intent. So they can actually communicate much better telepathically than they can speak out loud. Now, the next part is where this really makes it extremely powerful, and a lot of people miss it because it's buried in this wall of text. And this is the point of the whole video right here. The reason why I decided to create this video, because a lot of people miss this. Additionally, that empathetic link allows the master to share the familiar senses as long as the master concentrates. Just like the spell concentration. When concentrating, the master shares the familiar's 5 senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. In my mind, role-playing this is kind of like going into a meditative trance. The caster shuts his eyes, and he's not aware of his surroundings. He's not aware of his surroundings at all. So he's very vulnerable, so he has to be careful when he does this. Because in my mind, the caster's mind is inside the familiar's mind because he's looking through his eyes, he's hearing through his ears, he smells through his nose, and he can feel what the familiar touches. Example, the master can see through the familiar's eyes. If the familiar has enhanced senses, like superior hearing, the master does gain the benefit of those senses as well, but only as to what the familiar can sense. In other words, an owl does not grant his master the special ability of superior hearing. The master simply shares and listens through the owl when concentrating on doing so. So they didn't really word it all that well here to explain this, but it's what I expressed earlier. You meditate, close your eyes, you're not there, you're unaware of your surroundings, you're inside the mind of your familiar, and you see what they see, you hear what they hear, you sense what they touch and smell. And these familiars have their own enhanced senses, so you share that with them. So sharing the familiar senses is somewhat an alien process. A familiar does not always sense the same way a person does, like the toad. Some familiars may have a deficiency in sense all as well, or a lack of certain body parts, like ears. Another thing I want to point out is the fact that some familiars do not have dark vision or twilight vision. It really depends on the creature. You'll have to. There's no rule on that. The rules don't. The description of these animals do not state whether or not they have any kind of special vision. So you'll have to rule that using common sense. Obviously, I wouldn't give any of them dark vision except maybe the toad or maybe the weasel. You have to think about that. I think anything with dark vision lives underground and is afraid of sunlight, or sunlight's too bright for them to see outdoors. So you have to think about that. Anyways, continue. The empathetic link also allows, so there's more. You think what we talked about already is too much? It's really powerful. It's more powerful than a 4th level arcane eye spell. But there's more. The empathetic link also allows the master to cast a spell on that familiar that normally can only be cast on the caster alone, without even touching the familiar. 1 mile distant range. So you can cast shield spell. You can cast invisibility. You can cast any spell that you can normally cast on yourself, and you don't even have to see them. You don't have to be near them. You can be looking through their eyes at the time. No, you can't be concentrating and looking through their eyes while you're casting, because it's still a concentration to be able to cast a spell. But that's my calling. So let's continue. At the caster's option, the master may cast any spell on himself, and it will also affect the familiar, like the shield spell. So you cast the shield spell 1 time, and it affects yourself, and it affects the familiar up to 1 mile away. That is extremely powerful for a first level wizard. Even a fifth level wizard. It's crazy. If the spell has a duration other than instantaneous, the spell stops affecting the familiar if it moves farther than a mile away, obviously. The spell's effect will not be restored even if you return to the master before the duration. The master and familiar can share spells in this way, even if the spell normally would not affect a creature of that familiar's type. So that's very versatile. And I won't go over all the possible spells that you could really take advantage of. I'm sure you can use your imagination on what you can do. Whew! What I just read so far is just normal animal familiars. Nothing special. It's incredibly powerful. And then, of course, it becomes even more powerful if they summon a celestial or a fiendish animal. So let's back up real quick. In my mind, I do a lot of study of wizard casting and sources of magic and stuff, and in my mind, one of the things what I think is that these familiars are not normal animals. This is not animal friendship, where the druid finds a wolf and he casts animal friendship on him, and now the wolf is his buddy. It's not like that at all. What the wizard did was summoned this familiar from another plane of existence. That means it's not a real animal. It's a spirit. It's a celestial being or a fiend or whatever game world that you run, wherever these ultraplanar creatures come from. That's what that is. It only took the form of the weasel or the raven or the owl based on its need. It's a way to communicate and a way to present itself to the caster. Upon casting, that spirit, that celestial creature or being, chose that form to present itself to the caster, to his new master, based on what it decided it needed. That's how I look at it. You know, that whole entire chart where you roll randomly to see what animal you get, it's pretty much mimics the idea of what that spirit that you just summoned decided, the form it decided to take on. That's how I look at it. So then further on in the spell, it talks about actual summoning celestials and fiends. I think this is pretty much the same thing, but these are more powerful spirits that you summoned, because all the animal creatures you summoned, familiars, they're weak. You know, they're just animals and a couple of hit dice at the most, where these magical beasts are much more powerful. So in my mind, you just happened to be lucky enough or powerful enough or did it well enough to attract a much more powerful being or creature from another plane. So you have your chart, and these are very powerful. The familiar dragon, they all have alignments, so you run the risk of attracting an alignment that's not compatible with you. And I'd be a little bit loose on that. It doesn't have to be the exact alignment, but it has to have general attitude. Like if you're evil, it's got to be evil. If it's neutral, you're neutral. Good. It doesn't matter so much chaotic lawful, I don't think. It's up to the DM, of course. So there's a whole thing I'm not going to go over about the magical beasts. I just wanted to point out how powerful this spell was. And it becomes even more powerful with these. And I think the spell is already game-breaking. It's already game-breaking. And then it's even more game-breaking when you give them one of these. But it really depends on the kind of campaign that you're running. You know, if you're running a high magic campaign, then I guess it's good. And if you're expecting players to have a lot of magic items and level fast, and I'm sure this will be fine, depending on the campaign you run. But if you're running a gritty low magic campaign, giving them one of these, one of these creatures is probably more powerful than the entire group combined. So that's my thoughts on Summon Familiar. If you want to see any more videos about something like this, please post below. And if you have any comments of what you thought about this spell, something I might have gotten wrong, or a better way to handle this, please go ahead and post below, and I'll respond to that. So thank you so much for visiting the Three Orcs channel, and you guys all have a good day.